Isaiah presents a repeating framework for Israel's physical and spiritual restoration. We find a consistent pattern of exile followed by divine intervention. To understand the specific stages of this restoration, we will focus exclusively on the second half of Isaiah chapter 61. These verses detail the elevation of God's people following periods of intense suffering. Looking at the ancient columns of this text, we find a sequence for how a covenant nation is rebuilt from the ground up. Isaiah provides a framework that outlines a cyclical pattern of historical renewal. The core progression here is a structural inversion. The text describes how centuries of historical shame and subjugation are systematically replaced with a permanent state of priestly elevation. This exegesis will trace that process step by step, beginning with the literal reconstruction of ancient ruined landscapes. Reading this prophecy requires us to recognize its multivalence. Isaiah's words apply across multiple distinct epochs, returning from Babylon in 538 BC, the first century apostolic era, modern Israel's establishment in 1948, and the eschatological future. We begin with Isaiah chapter 61, verse 4. "And they shall build the old wastes, they shall raise up the former desolations, and they shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations." The first historical fulfillment of this text occurred precisely with the post-exile rebuilding of Jerusalem, which commenced in 538 BC. The historical catalyst for this return is recorded on this artifact. The decree of Cyrus the Great formally ended the Babylonian captivity, permitting the Israelites to return to Judea and begin reconstructing their ruined capital. This physical reconstruction was an arduous, multi-generational effort. As documented in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15, restoring the fortified walls out of these ancient desolations took immense labor that extended well past the initial return. The second major fulfillment of Isaiah's words materialized centuries later, following the devastation of World War II, when the modern state of Israel revived its land and infrastructure in 1948. This era of restoration required intense physical rebuilding alongside armed conflict, establishing a renewed presence within the city limits of Jerusalem itself. Finally, the text points to a complete, ultimate fulfillment of this rebuilding phase during Christ's millennial reign. The prophet Amos echoes this exact timeline in chapter 9, verse 14, describing a time when the ruined cities are rebuilt and inhabited permanently. Throughout each of these historical cycles, the pattern holds firm. The physical reconstruction of geographic stones precedes the spiritual restoration of the covenant nation. Verse 5 continues establishing this restored society, "And strangers shall stand and feed your flocks, and the sons of the alien shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers." Read literally, this describes a functioning agrarian hierarchy. During the era of restoration, foreign laborers arrive to directly assist the people of God with the intense physical demands of cultivating the land. By delegating the labor of plowing and tending vineyards, the burden of physical survival is lifted from the shoulders of the covenant people. Freed from the exhausting requirements of basic agrarian survival, the restored nation gains the necessary capacity to fully assume their specialized spiritual vocation. That specialized vocation is detailed immediately in verse 6. "But ye shall be named the priests of the Lord. Men shall call you the ministers of our God. Ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory shall ye boast yourselves." We see the spiritual elevation of the covenant people articulated by the Apostle Peter in the first century. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, he defines the early Christian believers as a royal priesthood, explicitly connecting them to Isaiah's prophecy. Modern revelation clarifies the permanence of this authority. Doctrine and Covenants section 13 dictates that the Aaronic priesthood shall never be taken again from the earth, operating continuously until the sons of Levi offer an acceptable offering in righteousness. This priestly role expands into a future global leadership mandate. Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23 describes a time when men of all languages will grasp the sleeve of a Jew, recognizing that God is with them and seeking their spiritual guidance. Isaiah's reference to eating the riches of the Gentiles is grounded in direct historical realities. In the first century, Jewish Christians who recognized the Messiah were excommunicated from their local synagogues. Cut off from their traditional networks of commerce, They relied on outside wealth to survive. Paul documents this exact economic transfer in Romans chapter 15, verses 25 through 26, noting that it pleased the Gentiles of Macedonia and Achaia to make monetary contributions specifically for the poor saints struggling in Jerusalem. The scriptural mechanism is highly specific. The material wealth of the surrounding nations flows inward to sustain Jerusalem, ensuring that the spiritual authority and ministry of the priesthood can flow outward to bless the world. The emotional and geographical culmination of this restoration appears in verse 7. For your shame ye shall have double, and for confusion they shall rejoice in their portion. Therefore in their land they shall possess the double. Everlasting joy shall be unto them. This establishes the principle of divine compensation. God replaces historical dishonor and confusion with a double inheritance or reward. Following the return from Babylon, Israel regained a twofold geographic prominence. They inhabited both the southern region of Judea and the lush northern territories of Galilee, replacing their previous desolation with a doubled footprint. In a latter-day context, this double portion signifies the complete unification of both the scattered northern and southern kingdoms into a single covenant body, a gathering explicitly detailed in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33. The underlying theology here is that God's justice is mathematically restorative. When the covenant requires suffering, divine intervention overcompensates the faithful for their losses. Moving to verse 8, the text defines the moral requirements of this arrangement. For I, the Lord, love judgment. I hate robbery for burnt offering, and I will direct their work in truth, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. The Lord completely rejects dishonest sacrifice. The Targum translation specifically links this robbery for burnt offering to the extreme violence and spoliation Israel suffered at the hands of the Chaldeans, making it clear that ritual means nothing without sincere righteousness. This demand for purity anticipates the transition from the strictures of the old law to the spiritual realities of the new. As Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13 explains, the establishment of this new, everlasting covenant through Christ replaces the old. Verse 9 reveals the generational outcome of this faithfulness. And their seed shall be known among the Gentiles, and their offspring among the people. All that see them shall acknowledge them, that they are the seed which the Lord hath blessed. The ultimate result of adhering to this covenant is unmistakable global recognition. The distinct divine favor resting upon these descendants becomes clearly visible to all surrounding nations. True, lasting restoration relies entirely on the integrity of an incorruptible, everlasting covenant, succeeding precisely where flawed human systems of worship fail. Verse 10 shifts the focus inward. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall be joyful in my God. For he hath clothed me with the garments of salvation. He hath covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decketh himself with ornaments, and as a bride adorneth herself with her jewels. Isaiah utilizes powerful wedding imagery here. The elaborate adornment of a bride and groom represents a careful, intentional transformation of an individual from a natural, unrefined state to one thoroughly worthy of entering Christ's family. In the first century, this profound transfiguration was fulfilled through the mechanics of the atonement, bringing justification and peace with God, as outlined in Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. The final millennial culmination of this joy and applied righteousness is mirrored in Revelation chapter 19, verses 7 and 8, where the faithful are permanently arrayed in fine, clean linen. Isaiah's prophecy culminates in the spiritual transfiguration of the individual soul. The chapter closes with verse 11, For as the earth bringeth forth her bud, and as the garden causeth the things that are sown in it to spring forth, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring forth before all the nations. During the apostolic era, this spiritual growth rapidly expanded outward into Gentile territories. Peter verified this process in Acts chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, quoting the prophet Joel to confirm that God was pouring out his Spirit upon all flesh. In the latter days, this same prophetic momentum accelerates. Joseph Smith History, chapter 1, verse 41, records that the angel Moroni quoted these exact concepts from Joel, confirming that this global blossoming was not yet completely fulfilled, but was imminent. Verses 4 through 11 map a clear progression. The text moves methodically from the physical reconstruction of a ruined city to the reorganization of labor, and finally into the spiritual flourishing of an everlasting covenant. This thematic progression operates concurrently across multiple historical dispensations. It remains a continuous, functioning proof of the Lord's absolute fidelity to His chosen people. This concludes our overview.